I think what I'd like to do is, while we still have the council member here, by the way, before you got here, I indicated that council meetings now actually seem to start on time. And that, therefore, when you leave to go to the council meeting, you actually do have to go to a council meeting. So it's understood. I thought we'd open it up for some questions from the audience while we've got everybody here. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Shakari Byerly. I'm a partner with Viteris, which is a public opinion research company, and also a graduate student in political science at UCLA. My question is about civic engagement. Voting is only one form of civic participation, and the council member mentioned the importance of community organizations, either nonprofits or NGOs. Do we know anything about differences in civic engagement, either giving to community organizations or involvement with community organizations, and whether that would be a bridge to political engagement and activity?
If I could just quickly say, we have some data that we're going to continue to analyze. One of it is we asked people what organizations they're involved in the community, and by far the most important one that came up was religious organizations. And that's probably somewhat different than in other communities. Remember, we went over that. It was really kind of striking. But David, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, there's two different answers. I think for outside folks trying to get engaged, corporations or even or politicians, the Asian American community is we're still growing. And I think one way, because even our nonprofits, it's more insular. The people who support our nonprofits are primarily from within our own community. It's very, it's the whole Asian model minority myth. Everyone thinks, Asian Americans are achieving well, doing great, but it turns out that when it comes to English as a second language, like in the San Gabriel Valley, it's not Spanish, it's Chinese. If you look at gang rates, crime, we have the highest test scores, but we also have the lowest test scores. So there's this huge myth that Asian Americans don't need social services, when that is definitely not the case, which is why one way to reach out to the Asian American communities is and that's where political, the bully pulpit, where they could get big corporations to donate to Asian American nonprofits, because Asian American nonprofits are kind of we get what's left, the crumbs, what's left after everyone else has given something. So that is a good way. I don't know if you're asking how bigger corporations could infiltrate into the Asian American community, but Asian American communities are always an afterthought, because it's always, okay, let's give to the Asian American community, but who do we give to? The Chinese Americans, the Japanese? Once you start divvying it up, then it gets very complex, so they end up not doing it at all, or giving a little bit to everyone.
I'm interested in those that are involved with community organizations, the nonprofit sector, not only providing social services, but also encouraging political participation as well.
Yeah, and again, nonprofits in the Asian American community, they watch it like a hawk, because they're a 501c3. They make sure, they won't even be fuzzy. It was difficult for me when I was reaching out trying to get help, especially you draw volunteers from nonprofits, but they were too scared to even help because they did not want to cross that line. So
very helpful.
Yeah. So
now I'm going to repeat questions so that everybody can hear, because we don't have microphones out here. Joanne?
In terms of the Japanese community and the Korean community, in terms of registered voters, both the Japanese community, because of the experience with the government in the 1940s, where they interned everybody, people that pulled the Japanese community together to get involved more in the political. In the Korean community, with the riots, I think that was another thing. Which, are you asking those questions? These are some of the things that the government has already sort of imposed on these two ethnic, both Asian groups, that I think have pulled them together to be more interested in what is going on politically. I know that because of reparations for the Japanese community were done during a Republican administration. Many of the people who were registering said, oh, well, the Republicans gave us the $20,000. So we will register Republican. But it doesn't mean that that's where they don't believe in the Republican doctrine. But they may have registered at that time because that was what the Republicans are the ones who, and the Democrats are the ones who put them into concentration camps. So it's like these are some of the things in terms of some of the questions that you have with some of the, I want to say the Japanese community who have had an experience, and the Korean community with the riots and things that pulled some of them back towards, looking at some of the political situations and what the impact has been.
If I could repeat it for everybody, because it's as much a statement as a very good question, which is that it's really important to measure and try to understand where people's commitments come from in the different communities here in terms of historical experience, especially given generations had different experiences. The 92 disorder is a relatively recent experience, and then for the Japanese American community, a deeply felt experience from the 1940s that's still felt today. We need to measure that. Now, this poll, as Dan knows, we spent many times thinking what we'd like to ask and cut out 90% of what we could fit in the poll. But we're hoping that more research would come out of this, and I think this would be one of the first things to find out is what brought you to where you are? Because we know in other communities it's certain government measures or things that occurred, but each generation will have a different, not just the four groups, but each generation will also have a different take. I think it's a very, very important observation, and I wish we had all that data here, but I don't think we're going to.
Comment on
Yeah,
what
of
Charlie
course.
was said and
Yeah.
what the speaker just said too. Yeah, especially for the Korean American community, it is LA riots, it is redistricting, which is more fairly recent events. But I think the bottom line, which I can't find your slide, but the number one request or concern from all Asian American groups is that having representation, having someone, and that really trumps it all. And I think Charlie went over all the different examples. And I remember in the Orange County race, where it's pretty much a split district, 50-50, a little advantage, maybe 1 or 2% Democratic advantage. I remember speaking to Speaker John Perez back then, and I told him, hey, that's seat. Because the bulk, the diehard Democrats and the Republicans are just going to vote strictly for the D or the R.
Mm-hmm.
But because Asian Americans want representation, they're willing to cross vote. Because our community is still building our empowerment, that we don't have enough representation to actually vet people out on issues or their accomplishments. It's just, oh my God, we need someone that looks like us first.
Right.
So there's a lot of cross voting going on. So and apparently the Republicans, and again, Republicans, there's so few minorities in Republicans. If you're a minority in the Republican Party, they just prop you right up to the top. But Republicans have been really taking advantage of this. And while the Democrats we haven't gotten there, because with the baseline party vote and you get the cross vote, you could win. So.
Let me throw a curveball at you, and then we're going to have time we're going to continue with questions. Filipino community, Filipino American community doesn't get into the conversation very much.
The least represented.
The least, but has a lot of numbers. But I don't remember a political conversation in the last few years where they have been a central force in the conversation. Charlie, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, that's careful, all right. I mean, obviously, I look at the data. Filipinos Americans in general are more likely to be Democrats. But if you look at the age groups, again, I have the benefit of other people might not have. It's the older Filipinos that actually have the highest Republican. It's around 30%. So it's tradition, family history. It's really hard to say.
Excuse me, Charlie. We have to say goodbye and thank you to Councilmember Ryu. David, thank you so much for coming. Great having you here.
Maybe they don't have that kind of traumatic experiences that the Korean American had, and then the difficulty in terms of immigration. So they don't. It's really hard, but they're more likely to get the information from mainstream media. I think they have less likely to have a language barrier. So maybe they are more in line with the mainstream thinking in some of the political leaning.
Could be. Okay, Stuart.
Well, thank you to the panelists, and it's been a real pleasure to partner with the Pat Brown Institute on the poll. 3 very short questions. One is, we didn't have time to show it, but the education numbers were quite stark. Close to 80% of Asian Americans want an expansion of the seats in the UCs and the Cal States. The questions I have are two. One is on the citizenship. I think Ping raised this. We're seeing an increase in citizenship numbers now, but it's probably, at least in the Latino community, it's probably the Trump phenomenon. And I was wondering if you had any observations on what gets people to want to become citizens. There's probably about 800,000 Asian Americans who are eligible to become citizens in California but haven't applied. And then the second question is, these polls, I think Susan can probably attest to this. Our poll probably costs 3 or 4 times more than an LA Times poll for the state. So, and we were pleased to partner sharing the expense with the Pat Brown Institute on this poll. But how do you think we can manage these polls that have to be done when the mainstream media refuses to invest in them?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
I feel like I have to defend my profession. You know, we've always had a problem, Stuart knows, going back into the 90s, where I brought a whole group of Asian leaders to the Times to explain about polling, because it is very difficult to poll the Asian community. And as Rafe alluded to, when national polls do polling among Asians as part of the overall sample, we only speak to Asians that speak English. Because it's very difficult, it's very expensive, it adds days, sometimes weeks, to get enough within the Asian community. And I always said it was a disservice to the Asian community because we lumped everybody together as one cell, as one subgroup. And as we find out when we look at these 4 major groups, the differences in a lot of them. So it is a very difficult thing to do, especially when you're looking at deadline type polling, when you're looking at the elections. You can't poll more than 4 days, five days the most. Otherwise, your numbers are stale and you can't get at it. So in the 90s, the LA Times did what Rafe is doing right now. We took individual Asian groups and we did a whole poll just on that group to get some, information about them, about what they believe in and their proclivity towards social issues, their partisanship, their civic engagement, whatever. So it is very difficult. Stuart knows this. It adds a lot of money to your poll, and at that point in the 90s, it added about $40,000 to the poll, and it added on about 3-4 days to a survey. Nowadays, it's much more. And this poll was extremely expensive, and it took us 3 months just to get 1,600 interviews. So you see the difficulty in polling these groups. So when you say in a national sample, we don't have Asians in the group, we actually do have Asians in the group, but we don't look at any group less than 100 in a group. And, when we use weighting, we have to weight up the Asians because we don't get enough of them. Because, we have to sort of, when you look at Asians, you kind of look at census tracts and you see where most of the Asians live so that you can get an oversample of them. And nobody does that in national samples. It's too expensive, it takes too long. And so doing these kinds of polls that Rafe does now, I think is so important to the community, to research, to anybody that is involved in community issues and whatever.
Okay. Well, let's continue. I think it's a good argument for saying we should keep doing what we're doing and figure out how to do it. Charlie, what any thoughts on how on earth we can do this over? I think Stuart raises a good point, and Susan indicates the complexities, but if we don't do it this way, we're accepting a lot of limitations on people's understanding of the community. And as a scholar, my view is always go with the truth, however hard it is to find it, and don't take the shortcuts.
I think it's one thing to really have a polling data that's recognizable is accurate. For those of us that work in the communities, I don't think this is much of a surprise, except actually Stewart had a Asian American nonprofit to be involved. I'm also chair of cause, and by the way, many of our summer leadership participants are here today because young people that are really interested. So that promoting interest in the younger generation, we know how important that is. Increase, they talk more about among friends because about what their experiences in politics, and they are more likely to contact the elected officials. And I think that's really a key to getting more involved. I guess the bottom line is for us that work in the community day in and day out. I think we know what the problems are, what both political parties are missing. To present convincing data to prove it is another point. But and as I mentioned that for a political party, if they plug a popular politician that was in Irvine and put him in another district and thinking that would work because that would draw Asian votes, and that just sometimes it doesn't work. So it's a lot more complicated than that. I think for those of us that work in the community, I think we know.
Got it. Yes.
Do you have data on other ethnic groups like South Asians and Southeast Asians? And do you have any insights you can share today?
Well, thank you. The question is, do we have data on other groups, Southeast Asians, South Asians? Not so much in this poll. We have the 4 groups that we identify, but then we have those that are not in those groups are polled, but they were listed basically as Asian Americans in general. So that would be a subject for another day. And which is, again, the reason we're having this conversation is to get your ideas about what else we should look at, because we intend, God willing, to revisit this. And especially after we've done a round of all the 4 groups, we're going to come back again with lessons learned. We've already heard a couple of things that we should dig more deeply. And one of the things that we've talked about with our working group is focus groups as a follow-up. And with what Joanne is talking about, I think the focus groups could be a remarkable resource for tapping memories and thinking what other groups we should look at. Unfortunately, I think you have to do one once before you have the credibility to ask people to help you to do something more.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Because I look at the raw data myself. I mean, there were other groups included, like Vietnamese American and Asian Indians included in the survey. But I believe their numbers are below 100.
Yes.
And each of these groups, I think we have at least 200-300 from each group before we really look into them. I mean, if we had done a poll like combine the Southern California counties, Orange County or San Bernardino, I bet the result, particularly if you include the Vietnamese Americans, I think the result would be very different.
We are just.
But this is LA County only.
This has made us tremendously ambitious for what else to do. By the way, before I forget, in your packet, the Ask the Data piece that we'd like everybody to fill out was your idea of what other data we should be asking, either from this poll or additional polls. I would like to hear from Mike Wu about this. See what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Ray. I wanted to say thank you for a fascinating survey. I think there's a lot to look at and to think about in the report, the findings you reported. I think especially the part about the role of religiosity, I think is very significant. What it tells me, I think, is that in some cases, churches and other religious organizations are playing a social role or are filling a vacuum that previously was served by secular organizations that may be declining in influence, but being replaced by religious organizations in some ways. But I especially would like to call for further attention to what you were describing during your opening comments as the distribution issues. I think in terms of the relevance to the presidential election at the national level and also the future in California, I think it would be very fascinating to see what you could find relating to the use of so-called wedge issues. In the case of Democrats, it gets to the distribution issue you mentioned about whether Democrats have the skill or ingenuity to divide the pie in a way that assures Asian Americans that they can get a fair share on issues such as, say, affirmative action. It also, I think, raises the question for Republicans about whether the Republicans can overcome the perception among many Asian Americans that they don't agree with a lot of basic Republican positions, but might be willing to vote for a Republican if they think they can get a better shake in terms of distribution or more attention to representation or things like that. So thank you for the study. I think it raises a lot of interesting questions both at the national level and at the local level.
Thank you, Mike. You've had your hand up for quite a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have two questions. So the first question is, as Obama's campaign demonstrates that there were a lot of small donations that helped his campaign succeed. But if you look at the data for monetary contributions, the youngest two contributors are the lowest contributors. But if we're not talking about like large-scale monetary contributions, but any donations in general, and we know that what donations may also demonstrate is individual investment in campaigns. So my question is that what are some strategies that can help increase these numbers in small donations? And my second question is regarding a news that was released a couple of days last week in regards to disaggregating AAPI data in education. Because I know that as students for a long time we've been trying to get the state of department to disaggregate AAPI data, right? But I just noticed that the California State of Education rejected the request that would give California nearly $500,000 to partner with local schools to collect ethnically disaggregated data. So I was wondering, how can students work towards that and help, undo that?
Okay, so there's two questions in this. One is, what can be done to increase the level of donations, especially small donations, which would widen the circle of people involved? And with a current issue about the disaggregating of data with regard to education, in which students would have a vital interest, is there any way to engage students and engage this debate? Dr. Yeo, do you have anything to say on that?
Maybe.
Okay, let me take a crack at the donation first, okay? COST also runs a program of training young people to be, how to prepare to be elected officials. And we spend a lot of time on fundraising. You're not going to get the money if you don't ask. I think there's a story told by Tip O'Neill. So he went back to the Irish community in Boston area and come across a lady that supported him many years and asked him whether she voted. She said, "No, I didn't vote for you." And he asked why. We've been longtime friends. She said, "You didn't ask." So, I mean, it's when you don't even spend time communicating with the community, when they don't feel that you really are related to them, and they're less likely to invest in you, right? And so I think that's probably because politicians are used to train by the old-fashioned ways. They're going to go by old statistics about what they consider high-propensity voters. And being the fastest-growing Asian community, maybe sometimes we overlook because they didn't pay attention to a recent increased participation. I think that's number one. In terms of segregation of data, and that's really and I know there's a assembly bill that wants to segregate data in terms of higher education as well as healthcare. And supposedly, actually Mike Ng could speak on that. The governor vetoed a similar proposal last year, right? So there's still a lot of convincing to do to demonstrate the need for such data. So
Can we ask Mike Ng to speak on that? Can you stand up? So
that was
we can
your
all hear
bill
you?
that was vetoed by the governor.
We did a bill called AB 1088 a few years ago, which actually started the state on the path to disaggregating. Faced a huge opposition from the governor because of the cost, so we got two departments to do it. And more recently, Assemblymember Rob Bonta, what was the bill number 1726, and Linda Waz played a big role in getting districts to do that. But this is really where, if you really want to know how far we've come and how little we've gone, that exact bill to disaggregate data in two departments, health and education, so that we know what's killing us and we know what's educating us. That bill, the governor vetoed because he said it doesn't make sense, it leads to balkanization. So I think there's two things that could be done. I think one certainly is to ask your local school districts to, on their own, disaggregate the data. We've done that in the LA Community College District, and I think Linda Wa's done that in Pasadena. So, but since I have the mic, I did have a question. But my question, that was a very good observation. My question was, this survey was directed toward registered voters. You may want to possibly do a survey of those that are eligible to vote and not registered, because I don't believe LA County, at least, has faced a voter registration drive, an extensive one in the last 4 or 5 years. It would be incisive to figure out why they're not registered to vote, even though they're American citizens, and what it would take to get them to vote, and whether their attitudes differ in any way from registered. And here's a check for $100 million to do that.
That was my next point. That would be a dream come true, it seems to me, because if we're really going to change the world, you have to look at the people who are not registered voters. In the world we're in right now, it's a lot more practical to use a voter registration list and survey a random sample of the registered voter list. But in the long run, what that does is it accepts the current situation as the reality. The PPIC has managed to do, the Public Policy Institute of California has done fascinating polls in recent years comparing registered and unregistered voters. And of course, what they describe is you could basically create a revolution in the country if the unregistered voters became registered voters, because their views are so different on so many issues. So, Mike, I think it's a great idea. I'm glad for your offer. Was it $100 million that you were offering? It's a resource question, but that doesn't mean you first start with what you want to accomplish, then you figure out the resources. And that really is something that I truly think we have to do. We have time for just a couple of quick questions. Rodrigo?
Rodrigo Byerly of Vitter's Opinion Research, and also I'm a faculty member in the management department of Cal State LA. Thank you very much for this very exciting and intriguing poll and presentation of results. My question is two-part. One is, can you share any data at all, and perhaps this is a question for Professor Colbert as well, any data at all about South Asian populations as it relates to religiosity? It strikes me that the religious habits, practices, beliefs, and motivations for people originating from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Nepal would be very different from those, as are the religions in, say, China, South Korea, North Korea, Vietnam, and so forth. East Asian populations versus South Asian populations. And our understanding is that the South Asian population in Los Angeles, California is growing, hasn't quite reached the size of that in Silicon Valley, but would perhaps express very different attitudes about some of the social programs that were mentioned, like minimum wage and Affordable Care Act. Second part of the question is, did you, for the results, the support levels around minimum wage and the Affordable Care Act, very interesting results by education and also by age. Did you look at the support levels by income and perhaps examine whether or not there might be a difference between those who make over $100,000 a year and those who make less than $50,000 a year?
The first one is similar to the question we received before, which is to look at the attitudes of South Asians and Southeast Asians. And in both cases, the answer is we don't have enough in this poll to do it. But that's not a good reason for not doing it. But that's going to have to be for the next round, because we need enough of each group in order to do that. Now, we do have income data. Gar, did you want to comment on that at all?
If you could write that, I'll write it down on my card.
Okay. Because we'll send that to you. This is a case where we have the data, could send you that information. As I recall, though, our preliminary look was that education was the more important variable in terms of attitudes. But I think we didn't include income on this, but we can easily, that's one we can actually send to you. So that's under the Ask the Data thing. If you had a question like that and we have the data, we'll just send it and we'll post it on the website as well.
I think actually that's a very interesting question, because I was looking for that too. And this is a LA County poll, right? So if you look at entrepreneurship, small business owners, Asian Americans is like 1 in 4 of the small businesses are owned by Asian Americans. as business owners, you would assume that they're less likely to support minimum wage and Obamacare. But if you look at the overall statistics, even breaking down by ethnic groups, that don't seem to be the case. I think I would do one more step and look at the income level. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah.
May
Dr.
I
Yang? Yeah.
add, if you look at the gender difference when it comes to minimum wage, women have 12-point advance.
A little louder, if you could just.
Women have 12 points more than men to support minimum wage, right? So you wonder maybe this is because the income level among
should
Asian
cross that
women
with
were
the
lower as well. So
It's very
you can-
helpful, and I think
yeah.
that is something that
So that's
we
the-
are.
yeah.
Oh, by the way, I just want to introduce Mike Fong, who's back here, elected member of the Community College Board of Trustees. You have a question, Mike, while you're sitting back there? Okay.
I'm Caleb Rabinowitz with the Yomiuri Shimbun. I have a question about you talked about sort of the generational gap, and I had a question about sort of communication. Is there the council member talked about how he helped his grandmother register or fill out her voter application and fill out her ballot. Is there in a community that has a lot of sort of multi-generational households, is there a lot of communication between these generations? Do you see households that are Republican, households that are Democratic, households that are independent, or are there sort of mixed households? To what extent does the younger generation speak to the older generation, or the other way around?
That's funny, because that was a question I was going to ask the two of you, which is, we've talked about the elders and we've talked about the younger folks, but we haven't talked about the interaction between the two of them. My guess is everybody in the room would have a story to tell about that interaction. But first, your thoughts, and then if anybody in the room has thoughts from their experience about how the young folks and the older folks are talking or not talking about politics, I think we'd love to hear it. So would either of our panelists like to say something about that?
That's really an interesting question. You know, but by the way, about communicating with senior 65, actually it's relatively easy to communicate Asian seniors. We just haven't been very good at it. I mean, one of the programs we do at COS is that we reach out to senior centers. You know, it's like a couple of weeks before the election. If you show up at a senior center, I could easily get 200 to 250 seniors listening to me or young people talk about politics for a couple hours. You can never do that you can never hold the attention of young people in that magnitude. And I think one of the advantage that David Wu was referring to was through churches. And I think that's a very convenient place to communicate to the young and the old people at the same time. But again, the barrier is that when we approach a church, ask them whether we can do a voter registration, they get all very nervous about, gee, are you going to talk about politics? You know, it's like we're a religious nonprofit. You know, are we getting a legal problem? So that's really a concern. So having a tradition about people coming together to talk politics, that's still lagging. And whatever needs to be done would have to be done at the individual, at the family level. And, you know, we got a lot of college participants here. I don't know if anybody feels strongly enough about whether they can talk to the older generation about politics.
This would be a great opportunity for anybody, especially since our original subject is Asian American millennials. Do any of you have any experiences with the conversations between people your age and your parents and grandparents in politics at home? Yes.
Hi, my name is Cal Morado. I'm a student of Dr. Yao. I'm Asian American Studies and Pan-African Studies.
Speak a little louder, if you will.
Hello?
There you go. That's good.
I'm a little nervous.
Or
Okay.
stand up. That's even better. Stand up. You notice, by the way, a lesson for everybody. Our two elected officials, when they were going to speak, stood up so that they could be clearly heard. So it's a good lesson for all of us.
So, I do have a story interacting with specifically my grandmother. She lives with both of my parents and my other grandmother, and she's my grandmother on my mother's side. She's the most political out of the four that I just mentioned, including my parents. She just came here maybe 5 years ago. Her English isn't so strong, but she tries. And she has a TV in her room and she's always watching Rachel Maddow. So she's actually the one that I talk to the most about politics. And I think where she and I have found our connection is, because she is relating, or she is watching more American media when it comes to that sort of news that she's looking for. She still watches Filipino news and Filipino broadcasting, but she watches that for entertainment purposes as opposed to news purposes. She'll watch CNN and what have you. But I think as far as making a connection with the older generation and the millennial generation, it's really just a matter of, I think it's just a matter of conversing. I think that my grandma is a really special case, I think, because she watches a lot of politics on her own. But I think that in order to address kind of what the older generation is thinking about, it's a lot more complex because, a lot of the data that you have shown today, there's a lot of gaps between age and there's gaps between religiosity, which is obvious between my grandmother and I. That was actually, I'm standing now, so I'm going to ask a question if you don't mind.
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is hold your question.
Sure.
I want to see if anybody else could say it. So thank you for that story. Why don't you stand up and tell us?
Hi everyone, my name is Ariana De La Rosa and I'm an intern at Cause. And kind of just adding on to what, sorry, what was your name again? Kat. Kind of adding on to what Kat said, I definitely agree there are differences between the millennial and the older generation. And personally for me, and something that was also mentioned in this conference is that our parents are usually more involved in the politics in their homeland, and then here not so much. I feel like here they're really influenced by what we have to say or what the media has to say or other sources because there's different factors that are involved language barriers and maybe not having the resources to know what's going on in the political world right now. So I feel like it is difficult to talk to the older generation, but kind of like what Kat said, it is all about conversing and trying to find that middle ground between the two so that the issues that are currently happening are being heard to our parents as well.
Thank you. Thank
Can
you.
I make a comment on that? Sure. I think it was mentioned before that for the older generation, they rely on more Asian media, so the understanding of the political system is a little bit different. And one of the most interesting discussions that we have, actually, historically, we know that the seniors, the older you get, once you understand the voting process, you are more likely to vote more often than the young people. Has been that the young people that we worry about because, we have statistics that show that young Asian Americans are the least likely group. I think we are tied with the Latino young people that are least likely to participate. And among the Asian groups, actually, the older people, they're more likely. I tell you what the problem is about the conversation, because I spend a lot of time talking to seniors. And I think we have really going to have a good discussion because if you talk to seniors about legalizing of marijuana that's on the November ballot, you're going to get discussion. You're talking about parental notification of abortion, you're going to have discussion. Same-sex marriage, you have a big discussion, both sides. Mm-hmm. And then if you talk about the last election, Prop 47, the prison reform, that means a lot more criminal would be in the street. They got all nervous about, the bad guys running around the streets. If you talk about water bonds, the eyes glaze. So it's just a matter of how you frame the issues, how the issues relate to them personally. When you talk about, Republicans and Democrats, for a business owner, you talk about the business policies, then all the people really get engaged because that impacts their business. If you talk about a senior that rely on government programs, you talk about, how politics affect their benefits, you really got a good discussion. It's a matter of, bringing the subject that relevant to them. I think one very positive sign is that young people are more engaged, more interest in politics. I think that's a really a good sign if we learn anything from this poll.
Great. Well, we're almost done, but Dr. Yao, you have a...
Yeah, I would like to comment on this topic as well. I also wanted to mention that there's a gender and the religion involved when you talk about family dynamics, because according to scholarly research, mothers are more likely to influence their children in terms of their religious beliefs. And it goes to both ways. And mothers are more likely to be influenced by their their children in terms of political leanings. So, there's very interesting correlation.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here and for staying, but mostly for giving us our marching orders for where we go from here. Great ideas, great feedback, and in our view, it's the beginning of a conversation. Let me tell you what we're going to do next. We're going to do a report based on this meeting that will include as many of your comments as we can. We're going to put more data out into that report and encourage further conversation back to us, because what we want this to be, since it's not an election day poll, it can actually continue the conversation throughout. So you can be sending us your ideas, what else should be done. Please fill out the Ask the Data card. There is also an event evaluation form. We actually have a box to put them in. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for being here. And also David Ryu, but mostly thanks to you. And we're very excited about all the prospects that you've opened up for us about further work. So once again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.